Have you ever wondered what truly hides in the dark corners of the world? Not the kind of darkness you can escape by flicking on a light switch or stepping outside at sunrise. I'm talking about the deep, primordial kind. The darkness that gnaws at your sanity. The kind that watches, waits, and grins when you look away. The SCP Foundation knows this darkness. They've cataloged it, studied it, and when possible, locked it away. But some things defy chains, locks, and reason. Let me introduce you to SCP-106, nicknamed The Old Man. Officially, it's classified as Keter, a designation the Foundation reserves for anomalies that are practically impossible to contain. Think of it as their way of saying, we're screwed if this thing ever gets out. Spoiler alert, it always gets out. So what is SCP-106? Imagine an elderly man, but stripped of every ounce of humanity. He's rotting literally. His flesh is dark, necrotic, dripping with this viscous, corrosive mucus that eats through steel, concrete, and oh yeah, people, every surface he touches decays like it's been left out in the elements for centuries. But don't let his slow, shambling gait fool you. The old man has all the patience in the world. He doesn't chase. He stalks. He lurks. He waits for the perfect moment, then drags his prey into his personal hell. Let's talk about containment for a moment. Though the word containment feels like a cruel joke when you're dealing with SCP-106. Currently, he's housed well. Let's call it imprisoned in a steel cell within a cell, surrounded by 30 layers of lead-lined barriers, each separated by thick air gaps. It's suspended in a fluid medium that needs constant monitoring because, apparently, the old man finds liquids mildly confusing. There's also an emergency light system designed to flood his enclosure with 80,000 lumens of brightness if he breaches containment. Fun fact, he hates sudden bursts of light. Not because it hurts him, oh no, that would be too easy, but because it seems to irritate him like you just stepped on his lawn. And trust me, you do not want to irritate SCP-106. What makes SCP-106 particularly terrifying isn't just his corrosive touch, or his penchant for dragging people into his pocket dimension, though both are nightmare fuel. Don't get me wrong, no, it's his behavior. He doesn't hunt because he's hungry. He doesn't kill because he needs to. He does it because he enjoys it. He prefers younger victims ages 10 to 25, but he's not picky. Once he's chosen you, he'll take his time. Break a few bones, sever a tendon or two. He likes his prey alive when he drags them into his personal dimension. A labyrinth of endless halls and rooms where the rules of reality don't apply. Victims report seeing warped reflections of themselves, hearing whispers in their own voices, and reliving memories twisted into grotesque nightmares. Here's the kicker. SCP-106 doesn't just kill. Sometimes he lets his victims go. That's right. Every so often, someone crawls out of his dimension, broken and bleeding, only to die a few hours later. Why? We don't know. Maybe he gets bored. Maybe he's showing off. Or maybe he just likes watching what's left of his prey try to piece themselves back together before their body gives out. Now, you're probably wondering, how does the Foundation even attempt to recapture this thing when it breaches containment? Oh, you're going to love this. It's called the Femur Breaker Protocol, and yes, it's exactly as horrifying as it sounds. If SCP-106 escapes, a lure is prepared, usually a live human within his preferred age range. The unlucky bait is injured, typically by breaking a major bone, to create the kind of agonized screams that SCP-106 just can't resist. The screams are broadcast across the facility to lure the old man back into his containment cell. Once he's inside, the cell is sealed, and the victim is left to their fate. I know what you're thinking. That's inhumane, and you're right, it is. But the SCP Foundation doesn't play by normal rules. Their motto is simple: secure, contain, protect. Notice what's missing? Compassion, mercy, anything remotely resembling ethics. Because when you're dealing with entities like SCP-106, you don't have the luxury of playing nice. Let's take a closer look at how SCP-106 operates. He's not particularly fast or strong, but he doesn't need to be. He can phase through solid matter like a ghost, leaving behind corrosive black puddles that mark his path. You might think you found a safe hiding spot under a bed, behind a locked door, but he'll just melt his way through the walls and take you anyway. And if you're unlucky enough to see him emerge, it's a sight you'll never forget. His sunken black eyes, his lipless grin stretched impossibly wide, the ooze dripping from his withered limbs. It's like death itself decided to crawl out of the grave for a stroll. But what's truly unsettling about SCP-106 is his intelligence. He's not some mindless monster. He's calculating, almost playful. He'll go dormant for months, lulling everyone into a false sense of security, only to launch a brutal attack when you least expect it. And if he's breached containment once, you can bet he'll do it again. Here's the thing. SCP-106 isn't just a monster. He's a force of nature, a reminder that some horrors can't be understood, let alone controlled. The Foundation can try to keep him locked up, but deep down, they know it's only a matter of time before he escapes again. And when he does, the only question is, who's next? Now you might think you're safe, sitting there, listening to this. But that's the funny thing about the old man. He doesn't follow rules, not even the ones we've made to keep him contained. So, if you start hearing whispers, or if you notice a strange, oily puddle forming in the corner of your room, well, let's just hope it's a leaky pipe. And that brings us to the story I'm about to tell you, a first-hand account of what happens when SCP-106 breaches containment. It's a tale of fear, survival, and the kind of darkness you can't outrun. If you're brave enough, keep listening. But don't say I didn't warn you. The alarms began at precisely 2:47 a.m., the kind of alarms that shake you to your core, a bone-deep wail that screams, something's gone terribly, terribly wrong. The old man was loose, and for the small town of a classified location, that night would be one they'd never forget. It started with a missing dog. No one thought much of it at first. These things happen in small towns like classified location. Then a teenager went missing. His parents swore he was just out late, probably hanging out by the old factory with his friends. But when the sun rose and he hadn't returned, the worry set in. By the time Mrs. Callahan disappeared from her kitchen, spatula still sizzling on the stove, the town realized something was deeply, horribly wrong. The SCP Foundation, however, had known for hours. The breach alarm from Site REDACTED had been deafening. Security footage showed SCP-106 melting through the reinforced walls like they were paper, dragging a screaming guard into a puddle of that black, viscous sludge. That puddle had led straight to the town, where the old man had begun his hunt. At 2:47 a.m., the Foundation locked down the town. Roads were barricaded under the guise of a toxic gas leak. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning for heat signatures, though everyone knew it was hopeless. SCP-106 didn't give off a heat signature. It wasn't a living thing, not in the traditional sense. Inside the mobile task force transport, Captain Harrow stared at the briefing screen, his jaw set. The room hummed with tension as the image of SCP-106's containment cell filled the screen. What was left of it anyway? "All right," Harrow said, standing. "We know the drill. The old man's loose. Our job is to locate him, contain him, and get out before we end up part of his collection." A nervous chuckle came from one of the newer recruits, Johnson. "Collection?" Harrow didn't bother sugarcoating it. SCP-106 doesn't just kill. He likes to play. Drags people into some kind of hellish dimension where time and space don't mean a thing. Victims come out broken if they come out at all. Johnson paled but nodded. "Stick to the team," Harrow barked. "No wandering off. If you see black sludge, you call it out. Don't touch it. Don't even look at it for too long." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And if you hear screaming, don't run toward it. That's what he wants." The transport jolted to a stop. The back doors opened, revealing the fog-shrouded streets of Redacted. Stepping into the town felt like entering another world. The streets were empty, eerily quiet except for the faint creak of swinging doors and the occasional distant thud of something collapsing. Cars sat abandoned, headlights still on. One lay against a tree, the driver's side door wide open, black sludge pooling beneath it. "Eyes up," Harrow ordered, sweeping his flashlight over the street. The beam landed on a rusting bicycle lying in a puddle of sludge, the metal frame corroded and twisted. As the team moved deeper into the town, they found more signs of SCP-106's presence. A storefront window was streaked with black handprints. A stop sign had melted into a shapeless mass. On the sidewalk, the air smelled foul, thick, and sweet, like rotting meat. They found the first body by the hardware store, or at least what was left of it. "Jesus Christ," someone muttered. The corpse was contorted, its limbs twisted unnaturally. Flesh had sloughed off in places, exposing corroded bone. Around it, the ground was discolored and slick with sludge. Harrow crouched next to it, careful not to touch anything. The face, or what was left of it, was frozen in a silent scream. "This one didn't make it to the pocket dimension," Harrow said grimly. "Looks like he got bored halfway through." They heard the whispers next, faint at first, like wind through the trees. Then louder, layered with a guttural wheeze. "Do you hear that?" Johnson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay close," Harrow ordered, but his hand tightened on his weapon. The whispers seemed to come from all around them, echoing off the buildings. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, carrying with it the sickly sweet stench of decay. Then they saw him. SCP-106 emerged from the wall of a nearby building, his form grotesque and glistening with black mucus. He moved with unnatural slowness, his sunken eyes fixed on the team. "Contact!" Harrow shouted, raising his rifle. The team opened fire, the sound of gunshots shattering the eerie silence. But bullets didn't stop SCP-106. They didn't even slow him down. The old man kept advancing, his lipless grin widening. "Fall back," Harrow ordered. The team retreated. But SCP-106 didn't give chase. He stopped, tilting his head as if listening to something. Then, with a grotesque squelching sound, he sank into the ground, leaving behind a bubbling pool of black sludge. "What the hell was that?" Johnson gasped, his face pale. Harrow didn't answer. He was staring at the puddle, his jaw clenched. "He's toying with us," he said finally. "Let's move. We need to get to the factory." The factory was the largest structure in the town, a sprawling, rusting building surrounded by broken fences and overgrown weeds. It had been abandoned for years, but the SCP Foundation had quietly retrofitted it with emergency containment measures after rumors of SCP-106 had surfaced. The team entered cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, the air was thick and humid, the walls streaked with old rust and fresh black sludge. "Keep your eyes open," Harrow warned. They found signs of SCP-106, everywhere corroded machinery, sludge-covered floors, and deep gouges in the walls. But the most chilling discovery came in one of the storage rooms. Harrow pushed the door open and froze. The room was lined with bodies. Some were fresh, their faces twisted in agony. Others were little more than skeletons, their bones blackened and brittle, and all of them were arranged in grotesque, almost ritualistic patterns. "This isn't just hunting," Harrow said, his voice low. "This is art." Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered. The whispers returned louder this time, echoing through the factory. "Sir." Johnson's voice was shaking. "He's here." The team turned as one, their flashlights scanning the room. Then the ground beneath them began to bubble and a cold, wheezing laugh filled the air. SCP-106 was watching, and he wasn't alone. The laugh wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling. It crawled under their skin, into their ears, and nestled in their skulls like a parasite. Harrow tightened his grip on his weapon as the puddle of sludge beneath them bubbled and spread, stretching unnaturally across the factory floor. "Eyes on the floor! Don't step in it!" Harrow barked, backing toward the door. The team moved cautiously, their flashlights sweeping the dark corners of the room. But the light didn't offer much comfort. The factory was vast, full of shadows, every corner a potential hiding spot for SCP-106. The bubbling intensified. From the center of the black pool, SCP-106 began to emerge. First, his withered hands, their skin dark and slick with mucus, gripped the edges of the puddle. Then his head appeared, his sunken eyes locking onto the team. That grin, too wide for his face, stretched across his necrotic features. Slowly, almost leisurely, he dragged himself up, the sludge dripping from his form like tar. "Open fire!" Harrow shouted. The room exploded in gunfire. Bullets struck SCP-106, tearing through him and splattering chunks of black sludge onto the walls and floor. But as before, the damage didn't faze him. If anything, he seemed amused. "Fall back," Harrow ordered, motioning toward the exit. The team bolted for the door, but as they ran, SCP-106 moved, faster than they'd ever seen him before. He phased into the ground, vanishing into the black pool with a sickening squelch. "Where is he?" Johnson gasped, his eyes darting around the room. The answer came in the form of a scream. "Help me!" Private Morales was clawing at the floor, his legs submerged in a black puddle that had formed beneath him. SCP-106's hands had materialized, gripping his ankles with skeletal fingers and pulling him down. The team rushed to help, grabbing Morales by the arms and trying to pull him free. But it was like fighting quicksand. The more they pulled, the deeper SCP-106 dragged him. "Don't let go!" Morales screamed, tears streaming down his face. Harrow knew it was hopeless. He'd seen this before. "Let him go!" he shouted. "No! Please! No!" Morales' scream was cut short as the puddle swallowed him whole, leaving only a slick black stain on the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrow stared at the spot where Morales had been, his jaw tight. "We keep moving," he said finally. His voice was calm, but there was a tension beneath it, like a wire stretched too thin. "Keep moving. Morales is gone," Johnson shouted. "We're next. You saw what he—" "Keep it together," Harrow snapped. "Morales is gone. We're not. We have a job to do." Johnson swallowed hard, nodding, but his hands were shaking as he gripped his weapon. The team regrouped in an office near the center of the factory. The room was cramped, the air stale, but it was the safest spot they could find. "We can't keep running," Harrow said, spreading a map of the factory on the desk. "We have to contain him." "How?" Johnson asked, his voice trembling. "Bullets don't work. He walks through walls. He's unstoppable." "Not unstoppable," Harrow corrected. "We know he doesn't like light, and we know he's drawn to wounded prey." "You're not seriously thinking about using the recall protocol, are you?" one of the other soldiers, Ramos, asked. Harrow's silence was answer enough. "Sir, that's suicide," Ramos said. "We don't even know if this place has the equipment." "It does," Harrow interrupted. "The Foundation set up a containment site here when SCP-106 was first spotted in the area. There's a femur breaker in the basement." The room fell silent. Everyone knew what the femur breaker entailed. Someone would have to act as bait, luring SCP-106 into the containment chamber by broadcasting their screams. It was the only way to trap him. "I'll do it," Harrow said finally. "No way," Ramos said. "You're the only one who knows how to work the equipment." Harrow opened his mouth to argue, but Ramos cut him off. "I'm serious. You're no good to us as bait." Harrow hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Ramos, you're on the controls. Johnson, you're with me. We'll rig the chamber and get everything ready. Stay sharp. SCP-106 is still hunting." The team worked quickly, navigating the labyrinthine factory until they reached the basement. The air was colder here and the walls were streaked with fresh sludge. "Feels like a damn graveyard," Johnson muttered. "Focus," Harrow said, though he couldn't deny the unease creeping into his chest. They found the containment chamber at the far end of the basement, a massive reinforced steel room lined with lead. A control panel stood nearby, covered in dust and grime but still functional. "This'll do," Harrow said, inspecting the setup. "Let's get it ready." As they worked, the whispers returned. "Do you hear that?" Johnson asked, his voice barely audible. Harrow froze, listening. The whispers were faint but growing louder, overlapping like dozens of voices speaking at once. "He's close," Harrow said. "Keep moving." But the whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, and far too close. Harrow spun around just in time to see SCP-106 emerging from the wall, his skeletal grin wider than ever. "Move!" Harrow shouted. The team scattered. But SCP-106 didn't go after Harrow or Johnson. His eyes, those black, empty pits, locked onto Ramos. "Run!" Harrow shouted. But Ramos was frozen in place, his face pale as SCP-106 reached for him. SCP-106's hand clamped onto Ramos's shoulder, and the soldier screamed as the corrosive sludge began to spread, eating through his uniform and flesh. "Get to the controls!" Harrow shouted at Johnson. But Ramos, "There's nothing we can do for him. Move!" As Ramos's screams filled the room, SCP-106 turned his head, grinning at Harrow. It wasn't a mindless grin. It was something worse. It was deliberate, the kind of grin that says, "I'm just getting started." Ramos's screams were all Harrow could hear. They echoed in the narrow basement corridor, sharp and desperate, each one punctuated by wet, tearing sounds. SCP-106 didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. He savored the moment, watching as the sludge ate through Ramos's flesh, reducing it to a blackened, oozing mess. Harrow grabbed Johnson by the collar, snapping him out of his frozen state. "Get to the damn controls!" Johnson stumbled, then bolted toward the containment chamber's console, his boots slamming against the concrete floor. Harrow raised his rifle and fired at SCP-106. Though he knew it was futile, the bullets passed through the old man, splattering more of the corrosive black sludge against the walls. But it got SCP-106's attention. The creature's sunken eyes shifted to Harrow, his lipless grin stretching wider. He released Ramos, who collapsed to the floor in a heap, barely alive but still screaming. "Come on, you bastard," Harrow muttered under his breath, backing toward the chamber. "Follow me." And SCP-106 did. Harrow dove into the containment chamber just as Johnson slammed his hand down on the console, activating the lockdown sequence. The massive steel doors groaned as they began to close, grinding shut inch by inch. SCP-106 stopped just short of the chamber, tilting his head as if amused by their efforts. Then, with that horrible squelching sound, he began to sink into the floor, leaving behind a bubbling puddle of sludge. "No!" Johnson shouted, frantically punching commands into the console. "He's phasing out!" Harrow glanced around the chamber, his heart pounding. They couldn't let SCP-106 escape again, not after all this. "Turn on the lights!" he yelled. "What?" "The lights! Flood the chamber!" Johnson hesitated, then hit the switch. A series of blinding floodlights mounted around the chamber flickered to life, bathing the room in harsh white light. For a moment, nothing happened. Then SCP-106 re-emerged, clawing his way out of the sludge like a man being pulled from quicksand. His movements were jerky, unnatural, but his grin had faltered. The light didn't hurt him, but it clearly annoyed him. He hissed, a sound like nails scraping against metal, and retreated toward the far wall. "We've got him," Harrow muttered. "Keep the lights on. Don't let up." Outside the chamber, Ramos wasn't dead. Not yet. But he wasn't whole, either. His body was riddled with holes where the sludge had eaten through him, exposing raw muscle and bone. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his hands twitching as if trying to grip something that wasn't there. But in his mind, Ramos was somewhere else entirely. He was in SCP-106's pocket dimension, though his physical body remained in the basement. The world around him was dark and warped, the air thick and suffocating. Hallways stretched endlessly in all directions, twisting and turning in impossible ways. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice echoing back at him. "Home," a voice replied. Ramos turned, but there was no one there, only shadows. The walls seemed to pulse, oozing with the same black sludge that had burned him. He could hear whispers all around him, faint at first but growing louder. They weren't just random murmurs. They were voices he recognized. His mother, his sister, his own voice begging for help. No, this isn't real," Ramos stammered, stumbling backward. But the dimension didn't care what he believed. The walls shifted, opening into a room filled with broken mirrors. In the reflections, Ramos saw himself not as he was, but as SCP-106 saw him. Broken, terrified, and incomplete. Then SCP-106 appeared, stepping out from one of the mirrors. In this realm, his grin stretched impossibly wide, splitting his face like a cracked mask. "Run," he whispered, and Ramos did. Inside the containment chamber, SCP-106 wasn't going quietly. He pressed his hands against the walls, his corrosive touch eating through the reinforced steel. The air filled with the acrid stench of burning metal as the lights flickered overhead. "He's breaching!" Johnson shouted. "Turn up the power!" Harrow barked. "There's no more power to turn up, we're maxed out." SCP-106 let out a low, guttural growl, his skeletal frame twisting unnaturally as he moved toward the door. The light didn't stop him, it only slowed him down. Harrow grabbed the comms. "Control, this is Harrow. SCP-106 is resisting containment. We need backup now." "Negative," came the cold reply. "You're on your own. The protocol is clear. Secure the anomaly at all costs." Harrow cursed under his breath. Of course they were on their own. That's how the Foundation worked. "Johnson, get ready to seal the chamber manually if you have to." "What about you?" "Just do it." Harrow stepped toward SCP-106, his weapon raised. He knew bullets wouldn't stop him, but he wasn't trying to stop him. He just needed to buy time. "Hey, old man!" he shouted. "You want me? Come and get me!" SCP-106 paused, his hollow eyes narrowing. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned toward Harrow. "That's right," Harrow muttered, backing toward the far end of the chamber. "Come on, you ugly bastard." SCP-106 lunged, his movements suddenly unnervingly fast. Harrow dove out of the way, landing hard on the metal floor. "Now, Johnson." The doors slammed shut, sealing SCP-106 inside. The lights blazed brighter than ever, bathing the chamber in searing white. For a moment, everything was still. Then the pounding began. The steel doors rattled as SCP-106 slammed against them from the inside, his corrosive touch eating away at the reinforced metal. The sound was deafening, each impact echoing through the factory. "It won't hold," Johnson said, his voice trembling. Harrow didn't respond. He knew Johnson was right. The chamber wasn't enough, and deep down he knew SCP-106 wasn't done playing. The pounding on the steel doors echoed through the factory basement like a drumbeat of doom. Each strike from SCP-106 sent shudders through the containment chamber, accompanied by the sickening hiss of corrosion as his touch ate away at the reinforced metal. "It's not gonna hold," Johnson muttered, his voice trembling. He paced in tight circles, sweat dripping from his forehead as he glanced between the door and Harrow. Harrow stood silent, watching the door buckle ever so slightly with each impact. He'd seen this before, watched containment protocols fail over and over again. SCP-106 wasn't a monster you could just lock away. He wasn't just trying to escape. He was toying with them. "We have to move to Phase 2, Harrow said finally, his voice cold and steady. Johnson stopped pacing. "Phase 2? You mean no. No way. There has to be another way." There isn't. Harrow snapped, cutting him off. You know the procedure. The recall protocol works. It's our only shot. But Ramos is still alive, Johnson shouted, motioning toward the far corner of the room where Ramos lay slumped against the wall. The soldier was barely conscious, his body ravaged by the corrosive sludge. His breath came in shallow, wet gasps, and his eyes were unfocused, darting wildly as if seeing things no one else could. Harrow glanced at Ramos, his jaw tightening. He won't make it, you know that. Johnson's face twisted in anger and despair. So what? We just throw him to that thing, like bait? Harrow didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted back to the containment chamber, where the pounding had grown louder. The door wasn't just dented now, it was warping, the edges curling inward like paper set too close to a flame. Yes, Harrow said finally, his voice grim. We throw him to that thing, because if we don't, we're all dead. The femur breaker was an ugly piece of equipment, both in function and design. A heavy reinforced chair bolted to the floor, fitted with thick leather restraints and a hydraulic press. The purpose was as simple as it was horrifying: to inflict massive trauma on a lure subject, creating the kind of agonized screams SCP-106 found irresistible. Johnson looked at the machine, then at Ramos, then back at the machine. This is insane, he muttered. Help me get him in the chair, Harrow ordered. Johnson hesitated, his hands trembling as he stared at Ramos. Sir, there's got to be another way. We could... There's no time, Harrow barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through Johnson's protests. If that door gives, none of us are walking out of here alive. Now help me. Reluctantly, Johnson moved to Ramos's side. The injured soldier groaned as they lifted him, his skin slick with sweat and blackened mucus. He was barely conscious, but when they strapped him into the femur breaker, his eyes fluttered open. Harrow, Ramos rasped, his voice weak. What's happening? Harrow crouched down, meeting Ramos's gaze. I'm sorry, Ramos, he said quietly. I'm so sorry. Ramos's eyes widened in sudden realization. No, you can't. But his protests were drowned out by the whir of the hydraulic press as Harrow activated the machine. The sound was unbearable. Ramos's femur snapped with a sickening crunch, the force of the press driving bone shards into muscle and sinew. His screams tore through the air, raw and animalistic, echoing off the concrete walls. Johnson turned away, covering his ears and gagging. This is wrong, he muttered, shaking his head. This is so wrong. Harrow didn't respond. He couldn't. All he could do was watch the containment chamber, waiting for the inevitable. And then it happened. The pounding stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the screams. It pressed down on them, heavy and suffocating, like the air itself was holding its breath. Is it working? Johnson whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Harrow could answer, the sludge started to pool beneath the containment chamber doors. Black and viscous, it spread across the floor like a living thing, reaching toward the femur breaker. He's coming, Harrow said. The lights flickered as SCP-106 emerged from the puddle, his skeletal frame unfolding like some grotesque marionette. His sunken eyes locked onto Ramos, his grin stretching impossibly wide. Ramos screamed again, thrashing in the restraints as SCP-106 approached. The old man moved slowly, savoring the moment. He reached out with one rotting hand, his fingers curling around Ramos's face. No, Johnson shouted, raising his weapon. Stand down, Harrow barked, grabbing Johnson's arm. But, stand down. We need him inside the chamber. SCP-106 didn't look at Johnson or Harrow. He was entirely focused on Ramos, who was sobbing and pleading incoherently. With a slow, deliberate motion, SCP-106 began dragging Ramos toward the containment chamber. Harrow waited until the last possible moment, until SCP-106 was fully inside the chamber, before giving the order. Seal it. Johnson hit the button, and the chamber doors slammed shut with a deafening clang. The light surged, bathing the chamber in blinding white as the system activated. Inside, SCP-106 let out a low, guttural hiss, his skeletal frame twisting unnaturally as he clawed at the walls. Harrow didn't breathe until the lockdown indicator turned green. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the screams had been. Harrow slumped against the wall, his body heavy with exhaustion. Johnson sat on the floor, his head in his hands, muttering something incoherent. "It's done," Harrow said finally, though the words felt hollow. But as he stared at the containment chamber, watching SCP-106 writhe against the reinforced walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. And deep down, he knew the truth. With SCP-106, it was never over. The air in the factory basement was thick with tension. Harrow leaned against the cold, damp wall, staring at the sealed containment chamber. Inside, SCP-106 twisted and writhed, his skeletal body pressing against the walls, leaving streaks of corrosive sludge that hissed and bubbled. The femur breaker had worked for now, but Harrow knew better than to believe the monster was truly contained. "We did it," Johnson muttered, breaking the silence. He sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than anyone else. "He's locked up again." "For now," Harrow said, his voice grim. He glanced at Ramos's broken body slumped in the femur breaker. The man's head lolled to the side, his face frozen in a grotesque mix of pain and terror. Johnson followed Harrow's gaze, his face pale. He didn't deserve that. "No one does," Harrow replied. He pushed himself off the wall and motioned for Johnson to follow. "Let's move. We're not done yet." "Not done? What else is there?" "We need answers," Harrow said. "This isn't the first breach, and it won't be the last. If we don't figure out what drives that thing, we'll be doing this again, and next time, we might not be so lucky." The two men made their way deeper into the factory, stepping carefully around puddles of sludge and corroded debris. Harrow led Johnson to a small office tucked away in the far corner of the basement. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a room filled with file cabinets and dusty computer terminals. "What is this place?" Johnson asked. "An old SCP Foundation outpost," Harrow replied. "They set it up years ago when SCP-106 first started appearing in this area. This is where they studied him, where they tried to figure out what he is." Johnson hesitated. "And what did they find?" Harrow didn't answer. Instead, he began rifling through the cabinets, pulling out folders and flipping through their contents. Johnson moved to one of the computer terminals, brushing away a layer of dust before powering it on. The screen flickered to life, displaying the SCP Foundation's logo. For several minutes, the only sound was the faint hum of the computer and the rustling of papers. Then Johnson spoke, his voice trembling. "Captain, you need to see this." Harrow turned, walking over to the terminal. Johnson had pulled up a file labeled SCP-106, Behavior and Origins. The document was long, filled with detailed observations and theories, but one section stood out. Excerpt from Field Report, redacted. SCP-106 exhibits a clear preference for human victims within the 10 to 25 age range, though it is not limited to this demographic. Its behavior suggests not hunger, but desire. The creature seems to take pleasure in tormenting its prey, both physically and psychologically. This sadistic behavior may stem from remnants of a fractured human consciousness. Historical accounts suggest that SCP-106's existence dates back to the early 20th century, with one particularly compelling theory linking the anomaly to a WWI soldier known only as Lawrence. Harrow read the file aloud, his voice low and steady. Lawrence was a corporal stationed in a trench on the Western Front. By all accounts, he was an unremarkable man, quiet, reserved, and largely ignored by his comrades. But wherever Lawrence went, bad luck followed. Soldiers who shared a bunk with him fell ill, equipment corroded, and then there was the smell sweet and sickly like rotting fruit. One day, Lawrence and a group of men were sent to investigate an enemy trench that had gone silent. When they arrived, they found it filled with mutilated bodies. The walls were coated in a black, oily substance, and in the center of it all was a small, unnatural hole. Lawrence got too close, he fell in. Johnson's eyes widened. The pocket dimension. Harrow nodded, continuing. Lawrence emerged hours later, covered in the same black sludge that lined the trench. But he wasn't the same man. His comrades described him as changed. He rambled about enclosed spaces, about darkness and destruction. And then, the deaths started. The file described how Lawrence's unit was decimated in the weeks that followed. Soldiers woke up with their flesh rotting away. Others were found entangled in barbed wire, their bodies twisted into grotesque shapes. Lawrence was eventually hospitalized, but the deaths continued. One day, he disappeared, Harrow read. His hospital ward was found empty, the walls and floors coated in black sludge. The only clue was a shallow depression in the floor, lined with human teeth. Johnson leaned back in his chair, his face pale. So, SCP-106 used to be human. Maybe, Harrow said. Or maybe Lawrence was just its first victim. Either way, whatever happened to him in that trench twisted him into this. Johnson shuddered. If it was human once, does that mean it still has thoughts, memories? Harrow didn't answer right away. He was staring at a photograph tucked into the file. A grainy black and white image of the trench where Lawrence had fallen. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a dark figure watching from the shadows. I think it remembers enough to hate, Harrow said finally. Before they could delve further, the ground beneath them shuddered. A faint hissing sound filled the room, followed by the unmistakable smell of rot. Johnson's eyes widened. Tell me that's not what I think it is. Harrow grabbed his rifle. He's leaking through the containment chamber. The two men bolted out of the office, sprinting back toward the chamber. The sight that greeted them confirmed their worst fears. SCP-106 was escaping. The steel walls of the chamber were warped and corroded, black sludge oozing through the seams. Inside, the old man grinned as he clawed his way toward freedom. "We don't have time for this," Harrow shouted. "Johnson, get to the controls. We need to buy ourselves a few more minutes." Johnson hesitated, but the sound of SCP-106's laughter spurred him into action. As Johnson worked the controls, Harrow kept his weapon trained on SCP-106, though he knew it was useless. The old man tilted his head, as if amused by their desperation. Then he stopped, his sunken eyes locking onto Harrow. For a moment, there was silence. Then SCP-106 spoke, his voice a low, guttural rasp that sent chills down Harrow's spine. "Do you think you can keep me here?" Harrow didn't answer. SCP-106 grinned. "I'll show you what comes next." With that, he vanished into the floor, leaving behind only the sound of his laughter and the promise of something far worse. The air in the basement felt heavier after SCP-106's disappearance. Harrow and Johnson stood frozen, staring at the bubbling black puddle left in his wake. "He spoke," Johnson whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't think he would." "Don't think about it," Harrow said, his voice tight. "That thing doesn't just talk, it taunts. It wants us scared, and right now, it's working." The sound of metal creaking snapped them back to attention. Overhead, the factory groaned, its ancient support beams straining under the corrosive spread of SCP-106's sludge. Somewhere in the distance, glass shattered, followed by the faint, wet sound of something crawling. "He's moving," Harrow said, gripping his rifle. "And we're running out of time. Is there anything left in this place we can use?" Johnson shook his head. "The femur breaker's fried. The chamber's compromised. We can't contain him." "We're not trying to contain him anymore," Harrow said grimly. "We're trying to survive." As the two men moved through the factory, the world around them began to shift. The walls were streaked with black sludge, the air thick with the stench of rot. But it was more than that. The factory itself seemed to warp, its corridors twisting and stretching in impossible ways. This isn't right, Johnson stammered. The layout's changing. It's him, Harrow said, his dimensions leaking into ours. Johnson stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide. You mean the pocket dimension? Harrow nodded. He's breaking the barrier. If we don't stop him, the whole town and maybe beyond will end up like his hellscape. What do we do? Harrow took a deep breath, glancing down the corridor ahead. It was barely recognizable, the walls warped and pulsing as if alive. We force him back. He hates light, chaos, and unpredictability. We hit him where it hurts. The two men scavenged what they could from the factory, cobbling together a desperate plan. They found old industrial floodlights, rusted and covered in grime but still functional. Harrow rigged them to a portable generator, while Johnson gathered loose metal beams, pipes, and other debris to create a maze of obstacles. He struggles with complex environments, Harrow explained as they worked. It slows him down, confuses him. If we can keep him contained long enough, the Foundation might have a backup plan. Might? Johnson asked, his voice sharp. Harrow didn't respond. The first sign of SCP-106's return was the sound of footsteps, wet and deliberate, echoing through the warped corridors. Here we go, Harrow muttered, flipping on the floodlights. The lights blazed to life, illuminating the maze of debris they'd created. SCP-106 appeared at the far end of the corridor, emerging from the wall with that same skeletal grin. The light didn't hurt him, but it made him pause. He tilted his head, his sunken eyes narrowing as he surveyed the chaotic scene before him. Come on, Harrow whispered, gripping his rifle. SCP-106 stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate. He reached out, his rotting fingers brushing against a rusted beam. The metal hissed and bubbled, corroding instantly. Johnson fired first, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The bullet passed through SCP-106, splattering black sludge onto the floor. Keep him moving, Harrow shouted. The two men fired in tandem, herding SCP-106 deeper into the maze. The old man moved like a predator, slow and deliberate, but every so often he would vanish into the floor, only to reappear behind them. He's toying with us, Johnson said, his voice trembling. I know, Harrow replied. The maze worked at least for a while. SCP-106 struggled to navigate the chaotic environment, his movements jerky and hesitant. But the sludge was spreading, eating away at the obstacles they'd created. We can't keep this up, Johnson said, panic creeping into his voice. Harrow knew he was right. SCP-106 was adapting, learning their patterns, and they were running out of space. Then Harrow saw it. A rusted catwalk hanging above the maze, its support beams already weakened by the sludge. Johnson, Harrow shouted, get to the catwalk, bring the last floodlight. What about you? I'll keep him busy, go. Johnson hesitated but obeyed, scrambling up a nearby ladder with the heavy floodlight in tow. Harrow turned his attention back to SCP-106, who was now less than 20 feet away. The old man grinned, his movements almost playful as he reached for Harrow. Come on, Harrow muttered, backing toward the center of the maze. You want me? Come and get me. SCP-106 lunged, his skeletal fingers inches from Harrow's face. Now, Johnson, Harrow shouted. The floodlight blazed to life, flooding the maze with searing white light. SCP-106 let out a guttural hiss, recoiling from the brightness. For the first time, his grin faltered. The catwalk groaned under Johnson's weight as he adjusted the light, focusing the beam directly on SCP-106. The old man staggered, his body warping and twisting as he tried to retreat. It's working, Johnson shouted. Keep it on him, Harrow yelled. The combination of light and chaos was too much for SCP-106. He stumbled backward, his form flickering like a bad signal. But as the sludge spread, the weakened support beams above him gave way. With a deafening crash, the catwalk collapsed, taking Johnson and the floodlight with it. "Johnson!" Harrow screamed, running toward the wreckage. Amid the debris, SCP-106 vanished into the floor, leaving behind only a bubbling puddle of sludge. Harrow found Johnson pinned beneath a twisted beam, his face pale but alive. "Did we get him?" Johnson asked weakly. Harrow looked at the puddle, his jaw clenched. "For now." As Harrow helped Johnson to his feet, the factory groaned around them. The walls were still warped, the air still thick with the stench of rot. "He's not gone," Harrow said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We just bought ourselves some time." And as they limped toward the exit, the faint sound of laughter echoed behind them, promising that SCP-106 was far from finished. The factory was quiet now, but not in a way that felt safe. Harrow and Johnson stumbled out into the open air, their boots crunching against gravel as they left behind the warped maze of sludge and ruin. The night was heavy with fog, and the cold bit into their skin, but even the damp chill felt like a reprieve from the suffocating rot inside. "You hear that?" Johnson asked, breaking the silence. Harrow turned, scanning the fog-shrouded town. "Hear what?" "Exactly." Johnson swallowed hard. "No whispers, no laughing, nothing." Harrow nodded. For now, the words hung between them, as heavy as the stench they'd carried out of the factory. The air reeked of rot and burnt metal, a lingering reminder of what had transpired. Behind them, the factory sagged, its walls buckling inward under the weight of SCP-106's corruption. "We bought time," Harrow said almost to himself. "For who?" Johnson asked. Harrow didn't answer. The Foundation's response team arrived an hour later. The mobile task force operatives moved with surgical precision, their black uniforms blending into the night. Portable floodlights illuminated the area, casting harsh beams across the wreckage of the factory. Harrow and Johnson sat on the back of a transport vehicle, watching the operatives work. They wore respirators and carried strange devices equipment designed to detect and neutralize traces of anomalous corruption. One of the lead operatives approached Harrow, her expression hidden behind her mask. "You contained him?" Harrow nodded, though the memory of SCP-106 vanishing into the floor still played in his mind. For now, he retreated after the collapse. The operative studied him for a moment, then glanced at Johnson. "And your team?" Harrow hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Gone. Just us now." The operative's eyes lingered on him for a moment, unreadable behind her mask. Then she nodded and walked away, barking orders to her team. When they pulled Ramos's body from the rubble, it was barely recognizable. His flesh had been eaten away by SCP-106's sludge, leaving behind blackened bone and sinew. But what made Harrow's stomach turn wasn't the state of the body. It was the expression frozen on Ramos's face. His mouth was open, caught in a silent scream. His eyes were wide, staring at something only he could see. "He's still in there," Johnson whispered. Harrow glanced at him, his brow furrowing. "What?" "Part of him," Johnson said, motioning toward the body. "That dimension. It keeps pieces of you, even after you're gone." Harrow didn't respond. He didn't need to. Deep down, he knew Johnson was right. The transport vehicle carried them out of the town, leaving the fog-shrouded streets and ruined factory behind. Harrow leaned against the cold metal wall, his body heavy with exhaustion. Johnson sat across from him, staring at the floor. "Do you think he'll come back?" Johnson asked finally. Harrow met his gaze. "He always comes back." Johnson nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah, that's what I thought." For a while they sat in silence, the hum of the engine filling the void. But then Johnson shifted, scratching at his arm. "You all right?" Harrow asked. "Yeah," Johnson said quickly, "just itchy." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "Let me see." Reluctantly, Johnson rolled up his sleeve. Harrow's stomach dropped. The skin on Johnson's arm was discolored, streaked with faint black lines that spread outward like veins. At the center of the mark was a small patch of sludge, glossy and wet. "Shit," Harrow muttered. "What is it?" Johnson asked, panic creeping into his voice. Harrow looked him in the eye. He marked you. The mark spread quickly over the following hours. By the time they reached the Foundation's debriefing site, it had crawled up Johnson's arm and begun to creep across his chest. The medical team tried to isolate the infection, but the black veins ignored every treatment, growing faster with each passing minute. "He's watching me," Johnson said, his voice shaking. "Don't say that," Harrow snapped, though his voice betrayed his fear. "He is," Johnson insisted. "I can hear him. He's laughing, Harrow. I hear him laughing." Harrow grabbed Johnson by the shoulders, forcing him to meet his gaze. "You're going to be fine. You hear me? We'll figure this out." But Johnson's eyes were distant, unfocused. "It's so dark," he murmured. "I can feel it pulling me back." And then he was gone. One moment, Johnson was there. The next, he was gone, leaving behind only a faint bubbling puddle of sludge on the floor. Harrow stared at the spot, his heart pounding. He knew what it meant. The old man wasn't done playing. The Foundation suppressed all evidence of the incident. The town was declared uninhabitable due to a chemical spill. Its residents relocated and sworn to secrecy. The factory was demolished, its remains buried under layers of reinforced concrete. As for Harrow, he was given a choice: retire quietly or transfer to another site. He chose the latter, though the nightmares followed him wherever he went. And every so often late at night he would hear it. A faint laugh, a whisper in the dark, and he would wonder if he'd been marked too. SCP-106. The old man is never truly contained. He waits, lurking just beyond the walls of reality, watching, listening, and grinning. As we conclude our tale of SCP-106, the enigmatic entity known as the Old Man, let's delve into some intriguing fan theories and a deeper analysis of this notorious anomaly. The origins and motivations of SCP-106 have long been subjects of speculation within the SCP community. One prevalent theory suggests that SCP-106 may not be inherently malevolent. Instead, some fans propose that SCP-106 was once a human, possibly a soldier named Corporal Lawrence, who became fused with a parasitic symbiote. This symbiote could be the black sludge associated with SCP-106, which took control over Lawrence's body, leading to the entity's current behavior. Supporters of this theory argue that the original human consciousness might still reside within SCP-106, suppressed by the symbiotic influence. They believe that expressing care or affection towards SCP-106 could potentially reach the remnants of Lawrence's humanity, suggesting a tragic aspect to the entity's existence. Another theory explores the possibility that SCP-106's actions are not driven by malice, but by a misunderstood nature. Some fans speculate that SCP-106's tendency to abduct and torment victims could be a form of interaction or communication, albeit one that is incomprehensible and harmful to humans. This perspective posits that SCP-106 operates on a different set of morals or understanding, and its actions, while horrific to us, may not be intended as evil from its own viewpoint. SCP-106 is classified as a Cater-class anomaly by the SCP Foundation, indicating that it is exceedingly difficult to contain due to its unpredictable behavior and formidable abilities. It appears as an elderly humanoid with a decomposed appearance, and it is perpetually covered in a viscous black substance that causes severe corrosion upon contact. One of SCP-106's most alarming abilities is its capacity to pass through solid matter, allowing it to infiltrate any containment measures. It achieves this by creating pocket dimensions, which are alternate spaces where it can trap and manipulate its victims. These pocket dimensions are described as labyrinthine and nightmarish, with SCP-106 having complete control over their properties. The entity exhibits a particular fondness for preying on humans between the ages of 10 and 25, often incapacitating them before dragging them into its pocket dimension. The reasons behind this preference remain unknown, adding to the enigma surrounding SCP-106. Containment of SCP-106 poses a significant challenge for the Foundation. Standard containment protocols are often ineffective due to its ability to corrode materials and escape through solid surfaces. As a result, the Foundation has developed elaborate containment procedures, including the use of complex structures and sacrificial decoys to mitigate the threat posed by SCP-106. The true nature of SCP-106 remains shrouded in mystery, with various theories attempting to explain its origins and behavior. Whether viewed as a tragic figure corrupted by an external force, or as an entity operating beyond human comprehension, SCP-106 continues to captivate and terrify those who explore its lore. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the enigmatic world of SCP-106 and want to explore more such intriguing content, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on the Old Man and other SCP entities. Thank you for listening and stay curious.